We had been married for 3 years, and in that time, we had learned the rhythms of each other's hearts. I knew when he was upset, when he was happy, and when he needed me to just hold his hand in silence. He had always been my rock, the one who supported me even when I didn't deserve it. His work as a teacher had always been a source of pride for me. I admired his patience, his dedication to his students, and how he would spend hours after school preparing lessons or mentoring kids who needed extra help. He loved teaching more than anything. But that night, at my parents' house, I began to see him through a different lens. Or rather, I began to see what others had seen all along, a man who was nothing more than a teacher. And in my parents' eyes, that was a flaw. That was a reason to mock him. I could still hear my mother's voice cutting through the air, sharp and condescending. "So Liam, how does it feel to be a teacher? Isn't it a bit beneath you? I mean, surely you had bigger dreams than this." And my father, with his usual arrogance, chimed in, "A man who works with children, who barely makes enough to live, what's his worth? You're supposed to be someone who can provide, not just teach." It was like a weight hit my chest. I glanced at Liam, sitting beside me, trying to keep his calm, his face frozen in a forced smile. But his eyes, those eyes that had once been so full of warmth and kindness, were now dull, hollow. I could see the sting of their words burrowing deep into his heart. They didn't even realize how cruel they were being. My parents, my own flesh and blood, were humiliating the man I loved. I tried to step in to shield him, but every time I spoke, they brushed me off. The words, the jokes, the comments, they kept coming, relentless, like waves crashing on a fragile shore. And all I could do was watch. I wanted to scream at them. Tell them how hard Liam worked, how much he sacrificed for his students, for us. But instead, I sat there, a helpless spectator in my own life, watching the man I cherished being torn down by the people who were supposed to support him the most. The air in the room grew thick with tension. Something I hadn't seen before. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that room. He wasn't the same Liam I had married. A change that I couldn't quite put into words, but it was there. The dinner ended in an awkward silence, my parents oblivious to the damage they had caused. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away, his jaw clenched tight. I could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a furnace. He didn't respond at first, his eyes locked on the road. But then, just as we pulled into the driveway, he spoke. His voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it felt like a blow to my chest. "I've had enough," he said. "I'm done, Emily. I'm done being their punchline." I didn't know how to react. My heart raced, my thoughts a whirlwind. Was this really happening? Was Liam, the man who had always been so calm, so patient, now plotting something I didn't understand? I watched him step out of the car, his movements stiff and purposeful. The house felt colder as I stood there, still trying to make sense of it all. Later that night, as I lay in bed next to him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I had seen Liam hurt before. His gentle spirit had been wounded many times by the harsh realities of teaching. But this felt different. This was deeper. He wasn't just angry. He was hurt, betrayed, and I couldn't help but wonder, had they broken him? Or had they unleashed something in him that I hadn't seen before? Days passed, and the silence between us grew. Liam withdrew into himself, his eyes distant, his mind elsewhere. I tried to talk to him, but every attempt to reach him seemed to fall flat. I watched as he buried himself in his work, staying later at school, coming home exhausted, and hardly speaking a word. It was as if he was consumed by something, a darkness, a rage that I couldn't comprehend. It was like the man I had married had disappeared, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. I'm not going to let them win. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something I wasn't prepared for. Over the next few days, I began to notice subtle changes in Liam. He wasn't speaking to my parents anymore, even when I suggested we visit them. He spent his evenings on his laptop, typing away with a strange intensity. When I asked him about it, He simply told me he was working on something important. He wouldn't tell me what it was, and a part of me was scared to ask. But then I began to see the clues. It was like he was preparing for something, and I couldn't figure out what it was. I'd catch him staring off into space, his jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed in a way I hadn't seen before. And when I asked if he was okay, he'd give me a tight smile, but it never reached his eyes. One night, as we sat down to dinner, I finally confronted him. Liam, what's going on? You're not the same. I'm done being the man they want me to be. I'm going to make them see me for who I really am. I felt a shiver run down my spine. This wasn't just anger anymore. It wasn't just hurt. There was something darker, something far more dangerous building inside of him. I could see it in his eyes. I didn't know what he meant by that, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't prepared for the man my husband was about to become. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of unease. I could feel it in my bones, the tension that seemed to surround him. Liam was changing, and with each passing day, I grew more and more anxious about what he was planning. I had to know, I had to understand. One afternoon, when he was at work, I decided to look through his things. I rifled through his desk, his drawers, hoping to find anything that could explain this sudden shift. That's when I found it. A letter, an email, printed out in neat handwriting. It was addressed to a group of former students he had mentored, students he had helped when no one else would. The email was filled with gratitude, but it was more than that. It was an invitation. Liam was organizing something big. As I read through the email, a sense of dread filled me. He wasn't just seeking revenge on my parents. He was planning something that would shake this town to its core. And now, I had to face the truth. My husband wasn't just hurting. He was becoming a force, and there was no stopping him. The days following that dinner were an unsettling blur. Each morning, I woke up to Liam's distant presence, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. It wasn't the usual silence after an argument. This was something darker, something far more consuming, and I was terrified. Terrified of the person he was becoming, terrified of what I was starting to see. His eyes were distant. There was a coldness in him that wasn't there before. A detachment that ran deeper than just the harsh words from my parents. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how the betrayal had been building for months. It wasn't just the dinner. That was only the spark. The fire had been growing long before then. I had seen it in his quiet frustration with his work, his exhausted face after each day spent teaching in classrooms, filled with restless students who didn't care about his lessons. The way he came home late, his shoulders slumped in defeat, but he never spoke about it. He never let me in. He kept it all inside. I had always admired Liam for his stoicism, his ability to shoulder burdens without complaint. But now I was beginning to see that those burdens were crushing him, breaking him down slowly, piece by piece, and I had been blind to it. The guilt began to gnaw at me. Had I missed the signs? Had I been too wrapped up in my own life, in my own world, to see what was happening right in front of me? We had always been a team, or so I thought. But now I wasn't sure if I even knew who he was anymore. I couldn't ignore the change in his demeanor. I couldn't ignore the way his eyes seemed hollow, like they were holding something back, something dark. He was no longer the man who would smile and joke after a long day. No, this man was colder, quieter, more calculated. He sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him, his fingers moving quickly across the keys. His face was tense, his brows furrowed in concentration. But there was something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. He wasn't just working. He was plotting. I could feel it in the air, a sense of purpose I hadn't seen before. And it terrified me. Liam, I said, my voice tentative, unsure. He didn't look up immediately, but when he did, his eyes seemed to have hardened. There was a coldness in them that I hadn't recognized before. Can we talk? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, his eyes unreadable. Finally, he closed the laptop with a soft click and stood up. "There's nothing to talk about, Emily," he said, his voice low and firm. "I've made up my mind." "Made up your mind about what?" I asked, my heart sinking. "I'm going to make them regret what they said about me," he replied, his tone steady, but there was something behind it, something that made my blood run cold. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I stared at him, unable to comprehend what he was saying. This wasn't my Liam. This wasn't the man I knew. "What do you mean, Liam? What are you planning?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked past me, his shoulder brushing mine as he headed for the door. "I'm not going to be humiliated anymore. I'm not going to let them destroy me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, he was gone. My mind raced as I stood in the empty room, the silence swallowing me whole. What had just happened? Where had the gentle man I had married gone? What was this cold, vengeful stranger standing in his place? The next few days were a blur. Liam continued to shut me out, his actions becoming more erratic and unpredictable. He would leave the house early, only to return late at night, his eyes tired but resolute. I tried to talk to him to understand what he was doing, but each time I reached out, he pulled further away. His mind was elsewhere focused, consumed by something I didn't understand. And I wasn't sure I wanted to know anymore. The distance between us grew, but it wasn't just physical. The emotional wall he had built between us was impenetrable. Every time I asked about his plans, about what he was doing, he gave me vague answers, his words sharp and guarded. But I could feel it. I could see it in the way he refused to speak to my parents anymore, the way he avoided their calls, the way he shut them out of his life. It was like he had become a different person entirely. Then came the night I stumbled across his secret. It was late, and I was unable to sleep. I wandered through the house, my mind a swirl of thoughts, my heart heavy with worry. As I passed the study, I saw the faint glow of light coming from under the door. Liam's voice, low and urgent, floated through the crack. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, unsure of whether I should listen. But I had to. I had to know what was happening. I held my breath as I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear his words. He was speaking to someone I didn't recognize. "I've got it all set up." Liam's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. "They won't know what hit them. By the time I'm done, they'll wish they'd never crossed me." I felt my heart stop. "Liam?" I whispered, my voice shaking with fear. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I caught sight of him on the phone. He froze as he saw me standing there, the blood draining from his face. "Emily," he said softly, his voice suddenly uncertain. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this." I stepped into the room, my mind racing. "What's going on?" "What are you doing, Liam?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, his eyes shifting nervously. "I'm doing what I have to do," he said, his voice cold. "I'm not going to be their laughingstock anymore." I felt the floor fall out from under me. I couldn't believe it. My heart shattered as I realized what he had been planning all along. This wasn't just about my parents. This was about revenge. A deep, vengeful revenge that was consuming him, changing him into someone I didn't recognize. I wanted to scream, to cry, to ask him why. Why had he let it come to this? But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stood there, my mind spinning, unable to fully grasp the gravity of what was happening. Finally I spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. "Liam, please, this isn't you. This isn't who you are." He looked at me then, his eyes empty, his expression unreadable. "This is who I am now, Emily. I'm not going to let anyone look down on me again. I'm going to show them all. I'm going to make them see me for who I really am." And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just about my parents. This was about Liam's own brokenness, his own pain, and his desperate need for validation. But I wasn't sure how far he was willing to go or what it would cost him in the end. I stood there, torn between the love I had for him and the fear of what he was becoming. And I realized, with a heavy heart, that the man I had married was slipping away from me, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. But there was no turning back now. The path he had chosen was set in stone, and I could only watch as he descended further into darkness. And I had no idea how to stop him. The silence between Liam and me had become unbearable. Every word felt like a weight, too heavy to lift, yet too necessary to ignore. I had seen the darkness in his eyes, the coldness in his voice, but I hadn't truly grasped the depth of his change. That night when he confessed his intentions, I had thought that maybe, just maybe he would come to his senses. But he didn't. Instead, his eyes seemed to burn brighter with every passing moment, and I knew deep down that I was no longer a part of his world. He was becoming a man I didn't recognize. A man who wanted revenge more than anything else. I tried to understand it. I really did. Their dismissive attitudes, their constant undermining of his worth, was painful. I had been there when they laughed at his profession, when they mocked him in front of me. But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just their rejection that had driven him to this point. It was something deeper, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I remembered how he had always smiled when he came home after a long day of teaching. He had always been content with what he did, proud of his work and proud of his students. But that dinner, that humiliating night, had shaken something inside him. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been the final straw, the spark that had lit a fire in him. The fire that was now consuming him from within. That evening, after our confrontation, I sat alone in the kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the house. My mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. I had married a man who had dedicated his life to making the world a better place. Yet now I felt like I didn't know him at all. He had been so full of hope, so full of compassion. But now, all I saw was a man bent on vengeance, a man who had been wounded too deeply to heal without leaving scars. I thought back to the days when we first met. When his laugh had been infectious, when his smile could light up even the darkest room. I remembered the way he had held me close during tough times, never letting me fall, always lifting me up. He had been my rock, my anchor in a world that often felt chaotic. How had we gone from that to this? How had the man I loved become so consumed by rage? And why did I feel like I was losing him, slipping through my fingers like sand? I couldn't deny the fear that gripped my chest, the fear that the man I had loved had been replaced by someone unrecognizable. But worse than the fear, there was the guilt. Guilt that I hadn't seen it sooner, guilt that I hadn't done more to help him before he descended into this abyss of anger. The days that followed were filled with an unsettling quiet. Liam became more distant, more consumed by whatever plan he was hatching. Whenever I tried to ask him what was going on, he would smile that cold smile, the one that didn't reach his eyes, and tell me not to worry. But how could I not worry? How could I stand by and watch the man I loved spiral into something so dangerous? Something that threatened to destroy not just him, but everything we had built together? I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop him. I found myself wrestling with the question, was this really the Liam I had married, or had I been blind all along? I had always known that life would throw us challenges, but this wasn't a challenge, this was a war. A war that he had declared, and I was helpless to stop it. I tried to talk to my parents, but every time I brought up Liam's behavior, they brushed me off. "He'll get over it," my mother would say with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Men go through phases. He'll snap out of it." But I knew better. This wasn't a phase. It was about Liam's need for validation, his desire to prove that he was worthy of respect. It was about his shattered pride, his need to make everyone see him for who he truly was. But in the process, he was losing himself. And I was afraid that when it was all over, there would be nothing left of the man I had once loved. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the empty space next to me where Liam should have been. The quiet was deafening. The distance between us had grown so vast, it felt like we were two strangers living under the same roof. I knew that Liam had made up his mind. I couldn't just watch as he destroyed himself, as he destroyed everything we had worked for. I needed to understand more. I needed to know what he was planning, what he was doing. The next day, I waited for Liam to leave the house, as he did every morning. But today, I had made up my mind. I would find out what he was doing. I couldn't keep living in this fog of uncertainty. I followed him. It wasn't something I was proud of, but I needed answers. I needed to know the truth. I kept my distance as he drove, making sure not to alert him to my presence. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed him through winding streets, my mind racing with the possibilities of what he was up to. Finally, he stopped in front of a small office building on the outskirts of town, a place I didn't recognize. I parked my car a few blocks away and waited, my hands trembling in my lap. I didn't know what I expected to find, but the tension in my body told me that this was it. This was the moment that everything would change. He was inside for over an hour. My mind ran wild with questions. Who was he meeting? What was he planning? When he finally emerged, he wasn't alone. There was another man with him, someone I didn't recognize. They shook hands, exchanged a few words, and then the man walked away, leaving Liam standing in front of the building, looking out over the parking lot. I watched as he stood there for a moment, his face unreadable. He had the look of someone who had just made a decision, someone who knew that there was no going back. And in that moment, I realized something that made my blood run cold. He wasn't just planning revenge on my parents. This was bigger than that. This wasn't just about proving his worth. This was about making a statement. And I was afraid of what that statement would be. That night, as I lay awake in bed, my mind raced. I had seen the look in his eyes, the same look I had seen when he spoke those chilling words. I'm going to make them regret what they said about me. I couldn't help but feel that I was losing him. Losing the man I had married, the man who had been kind and loving, the man who had given everything to his students, his work, and our life together. But now all I saw was a man consumed by his need for revenge. A man who was willing to sacrifice everything in order to make others see him as he wanted to be seen. And I wasn't sure where that would leave me. Would there be anything left of the man I loved when all was said and done? Or would I be left standing in the wreckage of our lives, wondering how I had let it all slip away? I didn't have the answers. But one thing was certain. I couldn't sit back any longer. I couldn't keep watching as he dug himself deeper into this hole. I had to make a choice. I had to decide whether I was going to stand by and watch him destroy everything, or if I was going to take matters into my own hands. And as the weight of that decision pressed down on me, I knew that there was no turning back.